Welcome back to the Rebuilt Parish Podcast. Today in the studio, we've got Austin Suggs from Gospel Simplicity and Tom Corcoran, and we are talking all about digital discipleship and how you can reach the de-churched and unchurched through digital media. We're excited for you to get the opportunity to learn from Austin. He's going to share some great stories, some insights, and speak to how authentically sharing can help you connect with the de-churched and unchurched. Now, why do you want to learn from Austin? Well, so many incredible reasons. One of them is that he's got 86,000 followers, and we can't wait for you to hear the story with how we got connected with him. We'll see you inside the episode. Well, Austin, thank you so much for joining us on the Rebuilt Parish Podcast today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're excited that we've got you here, and we've got Austin and Tom today as the result of a really great video that you created, Austin, where you had shared your experience at Church of the Nativity. And in that video, you had shared, I'd love to talk to this Tom Corcoran guy. And so now we're making it happen, and I'm pretty excited about this. How about you, Tom?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm laughing, Austin, because my kids watched the video, and so for the over vacation, they were calling me some seemingly random guy. That was their new word for me. So my wife said she wanted to get a T-shirt wonderful. That said that. So anyway, for me. So anyway,
we can make that happen.
That come back to haunt me.
I love it. Well, Austin, could you start just by sharing a bit about your journey where, you started with a non-denominational church, you launched Gospel Simplicity, and now you're diving deep into theology and ecumenism. Can you just share with us what sparked all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll try to give the short version and we can kind of follow any rabbit trails you'd like from there. But I grew up in a non-denominational church, about like 2,000 person church. My mom was on staff and she was the creative director there. So I like to say that I spent my childhood like in church sound booths and at worship practices during the week. And so that was like my only picture of church growing up. And I loved it. I was super involved in it. Ended up doing an internship there between high school and college to do kind of a gap year. And I fell in love with teaching. I like to say they made the mistake of letting me teach in the high school ministry, which showed me everything I didn't know. So I went off to study theology, got an undergrad in theology at Moody Bible Institute. And it was from that love of teaching that I first started making YouTube videos just as a way of practicing speaking. But eventually I made a video about the fact I had gone to a Catholic Bible study like years before, and I didn't think anything of it. Like 10 people watched my videos at that point, and it was like my mom, my grandma, and then like 8 YouTube bots. Like I think that was everyone who watched them. But that video blew up, and all of a sudden there was a bunch of really smart Catholics asking me questions I didn't know the answers to. And so I figured the best thing I could do was try to find smart people to ask those questions to. So that's how I started doing interviews and church tours. And the rest kind of just took off from there. And so it was a mix of, trying to find answers and then also just being a really curious person about theology. And that led me to kind of doing what I do now on YouTube.
Hey, Austin, who did you seek out for questions about Catholic theology?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of it was like some of the guys from Catholic Answers that were popping up on my YouTube feed at that point. So interviewed people like Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin and a bunch of those guys, and just kind of kept at that point taking advice from the people who were showing up in the comments. Like I'd make a video and they'd say, oh, you've got to go to a mass. So I went to a mass and they're like, oh, I want to see this church. So I made a tour of it. And they're like, you need to talk to Trent Horn. So I did it, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
So they would respond. I mean, Jimmy Akin, they would respond and say, yeah, I'll be on your podcast. Or was it on your podcast, or just conversations you had off of that?
Yeah, it was on my podcast. And I got very lucky that the first church I went to after people said, like, you've got to go to a church, happens to be like one of the most beautiful churches in America. And that video blew up. And I think similar to this, a bunch of people in Catholic circles started sending that video around. And so when I was asking, Trent or Jimmy, if they'd come on the channel, they might have already seen that, and it made it a little bit easier. So I had kind of a nice, easy path into that world.
I love that. Well, Austin, you talked about people commenting and starting to have thoughtful conversations. And we could see that happening just when we saw that one video that you shared about Nativity. So we know that your channel has become this hub for thoughtful theological conversation across different traditions, which is really incredible. So, how do you see this work that you're doing contributing to digital discipleship?
Yeah, what a great question. So, when I look at least the kind of like corner of the internet that I inhabit, I know everyone's YouTube algorithm is going to look a lot different and the videos you see are going to look different than mine. But in kind of the space that I'm in, there's a lot of people who are like me, a lot of young men especially, who maybe grew up Protestant and are looking for a sense of rootedness and a sense of tradition. And they're just trying to make sense of all that. And it can be a really anxiety inducing and kind of head spinning space to be in. And so I see a lot of what I do trying to just like walk with people through that, show them like, you're not crazy for asking these questions. And it's complicated and difficult. And here's my, best offering I can give you as far as the best and brightest people to talk to, some perspectives on these things. So I really try to help people with that because in a lot of ways I can see this kind of anxiety and restlessness either be channeled in healthy ways or it can turn into like a form of deconstruction. And having had a bit of an experience with that myself, I really want to see people, be able to go through this and take like whatever step makes sense for them in their faith journey. I'm not particularly concerned whether they come to the same conclusions as me, but I would like them to keep pursuing Christ in the midst of that. So I try to help with that.
I mean, it's interesting, Austin. You're a different story. I'm trying to guess your age a little bit. I can
26.
just ask you your age, I guess. What's that? 26? Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting. I'm 51. So it is interesting. So I grew up what I call Philly Catholic. Okay. And by that, I mean a lot of doctrine, a lot of really good, solid teaching and foundation. But what I would say was missing in that for me is at the end, the personal relationship with Christ and a real understanding, of Scripture. And in my story, I would say it was the non-denominational churches or the evangelical churches that taught me. I say three things I think that helped me in my personal faith. One was a personal relationship with Jesus. Two was the Bible and Scripture and loving God's Word. And three was music. And I love music. And the music I heard in Catholic church growing up was just terrible. It's awful, and it's still a problem in Catholic world in many places. The other way to go. But it was interesting. But I had the foundation, and so now a next generation, and we are kind of different generations. You got, I think, my guess is some of the personal stuff, the Bible stuff, but you didn't get the institutional stuff, or I'm not sure how else to say that, but yeah. So it is interesting how that evolves and what people need. I think they need both, but. Is that kind of what you're finding too? Is that what you need?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember talking to some people when I was doing my undergrad, and they would have these conversations with their parents, even like within the Protestant world. Their parents grew up in like a mainline church and it was boring. And then the kind of seeker sensitive movement came up and they were like so excited about the non-denominational kind of expression of church, and they went all in. The kids grew up with that and they loved, they were at Moody. Like they loved their faith, but now like they were becoming Anglican or they were looking into the Catholic Church because there was something missing for them. And so I think you're absolutely right that people need both. You need that like dynamism of a personal relationship with Christ. And then people are also looking for something that can carry them through the various stages of life, I think, as well. Because I think at times, if all you have is like excitement and your faith looks like conferences and worship, and that's like all you have, it doesn't always survive the transition from young adulthood to adulthood, or even adulthood to having kids, or the kids growing up or whatnot. So I think some people are just looking for something that can carry them through when maybe like the emotions aren't there as well.
Something to anchor them a little deeper. Yeah. And that's where the tradition can help. And I would, as Catholics, say the big T tradition ultimately, but also little traditions as well. I do think there is something, and I don't know, a maturity to understand. Like, I think there's one way people can sometimes look back at what they got as a child or young growing up in your early formation and get mad at it. Well, why didn't they tell me all these things? Or why didn't they give me that? But I don't know. I think there's also maturity to say, okay, I didn't get that. And it's also maturity is like, why didn't my parents teach me whatever to understand? No, I'm an adult now And I need to go figure out what I did not receive and go search it out, which is, I think, what you have kind of done and encouraging others to do as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that as well. You mentioned a little at the beginning, like they can feel angry about this. And I think also people can kind of like make a big switch in their life and assume that everything they had before was bad. So like
Yes.
the Philly Catholic experience, like, oh, I don't need the doctrine. All I need is this. Or, you know, if it's the opposite experience, like, oh, that was so shallow. When in reality, you know, it was maybe that shallow experience that is the reason that you still care about these questions, right? Or it was that doctrine that was really important that allowed you to think like, wait, it's worth pursuing this kind of personal relationship. So I think it's helpful for people to be able to see, you know, maybe like the incompleteness of a certain upbringing, but also be able to really appreciate what it did give them while taking ownership to kind of find the rest.
That's a great point. I love that point.
I have to tell you, I love this conversation so much. Number one, from an ecumenical standpoint, because I think it's so important for us to connect with the rest of the people in the Big C Church, you know, Big C Church family. But I'll share, Austin, your story sounds so much like a story that I have one of the women in my small group has, where she grew up in an evangelical church and felt drawn towards a more liturgical experience, tried out different churches to see, you know, what fit, because she had some of those same experiences that you had growing up, but was craving a little bit more. And then, Tom, we've talked about this. My experience is a little bit more like yours, where, you know, I grew up in the traditional Catholic environment, but then had some experiences in evangelical churches where I was like, wait, why isn't my church doing that? But I think these conversations are so important so that we can see, we can all be learning from each other. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, we point out in Rebuilt a little bit, sorry, us, you know, that Vatican II says that Protestants are separated brethren. So if there are brethren, then we have something to learn from each other, and we can learn from each other in our faith walk. Austin, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's exactly the way to approach it. And I think there's just been so much fruit from that, going in both directions. You know, I've seen people, even when they maybe don't convert, like myself, having gained so much from my experience getting to know not just like Catholics individually, but Catholic teaching generally, and vice versa as well. You know, seeing Catholics who really benefit from their engagement with evangelicals or other groups. And so I think the vision that Vatican II gives there is really helpful for being able to see the good kind of across the traditional divides.
Now, Austin, we talked a little bit in the beginning how this interview all started because of that video you shared about your visit to Church of the Nativity. And we would love for you to share with our listeners who maybe haven't seen that video yet, which we're going to be linking that in the show notes so everybody can take a look at that video. But we'd love for you to share with them what stood out to you about the Nativity approach to Mass, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning that video. So I guess, you know, the biggest thing that stood out to me was in so many ways how familiar it felt to me from my own upbringing, but also the foreignness that kind of went together with that. So, you know, stylistically from the building, I talk about the experience of just like the little things, like the parking crew. Like I'm so used to that, right? And kind of coming in and the way the announcements are done and all of that. Like, especially as I say, like growing up and having been on staff at churches, you kind of notice all the things, like when you're in the production meeting every week and you're thinking about the flow of the service, right? And so seeing how those things were done was really interesting, but simultaneously seeing, you know, those elements of evangelical like worship style that you might be used to, or even like building design and dimensions of things like small group and the way the kids ministry is done, having that coupled with all the kind of traditional elements of a Mass. And I was really impressed with the way that you guys thread things together to make it make sense to someone who's there for the first time. In fact, on my way home from that service, I called my mom and talked to her about this because, you know, we were always talking about flow of service and things like this, and just having a really fun time thinking through the little things that you guys did to make all of that work while having every element of the Mass, because I've seen, like evangelicals try to throw in more traditional elements, but you guys really did seem to kind of weave those two things together quite nicely.
Well, I think Pablo and the production team would appreciate hearing all of that, Tom. I can't wait for that whole team to hear all of that. But Tom, you know what goes into making all of that. So maybe you could just share a little bit with Austin about why it's so important that we've kept all of those traditional Mass elements, but maybe incorporated some of those production pieces that you learned from some of our evangelical brothers and sisters.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think there was never a thought of not keeping the traditional elements. So it's like, it is who we are and what we do. We know the rubrics and the rituals of the Mass, and that is given to us, and that's not for us to mess with, so to speak. And I think sometimes that is the misconception of people that somehow we have, and there's never been a thought of that. At the same time, I think Father Michael is really good at understanding what is the Mass trying to achieve. And I think, again, in Catholic world, there can become this legalism. Well, it's the rules say this, and we just keep to the rules. And there is certain guidelines, certain, guardrails, so to speak. And some are deeper than others as far as what is the matter you need to use to confect the Eucharist and things like that. But there's also then a spirit of what is the Mass trying to achieve, and to look at the Mass as, we would say, a spiritual journey, and taking people on a journey, which, kind of, Austin, you're talking about in an evangelical service. You're going to say, what is the flow and where are we trying to lead people? Well, the Mass is trying to lead people somewhere. It's already there. We just have to uncover it and help make it more apparent to people. So, and I think a little bit of, you're talking about the flow, Austin. Sometimes it is just transitions. Sometimes it's paying attention to those transitions is one part of that. Other thing we tried over the years too is, how do we bring, contemporary worship music in it so that it sits in the Mass? Sometimes parishes try to do more contemporary worship music, and it's just off. And it's all, and people and pastors or parish leaders say, well, I don't like that music. And they're right, because the music selected has not fit into the right time of the Mass. So that is, over the years, we have tried to continue to hone in and work on what works here and what does not work, as we try to blend these two things together. And so, obviously, again, this is many years of sort of, again, experimentation can sometimes sound bad. It sounds like we're trying to change something in the Mass, but we're not. But it is experimentation of what works and bringing this together.
Well, Austin, I've got another question for you about really what you're doing with gospel simplicity. And what I want to call attention to for our listeners is you have quite the big community and quite the big following, which is incredible. We've been talking about digital discipleship, and what you're doing is helping people to connect the dots and foster conversation. And we love that you include interviews, talking about Bible studies, and doing some of these church tours, which have been so popular. So what do you think as far as which have you found are the most effective, which are creating the most conversation and maybe bearing the most fruit for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I suppose it depends on how you measure that, right? Not to make it sound too much like marketing, but that's kind of the background I had to pay the bills for a long time. You can kind of think of it like a funnel. There's certain videos that are going to appeal to a large audience, and then there are some that are really in the weeds for the theology nerds amongst us. And I say that with love and affection, because I'm one of them. So I think, things like the church tours are often some of the most accessible things, right? You don't need to love theology and want to kind of parse, these various definitions of something to appreciate someone walking around a cathedral and say wow, that's really beautiful. And I think those are the videos that are going to have appeal to people who, aren't as in the weeds and maybe aren't even as committed Christians. Because a lot of what I do, it's not so much evangelism focused as it is more kind of helping people go deeper and maybe catechetical in nature. But those videos, I think, can appeal to people of oh, that's just something beautiful that I'd like to be a part of, or show people kind of the breadth of the tradition. Whereas other videos, I think, can be successful when they might not be as popular, but they help someone kind of work through a difficult issue, or they challenge someone to think in new ways. So those are some of the things I'm trying to think about as I'm making a video of is this one for everyone? Is this for these certain people? And what am I trying to kind of help them come away from the video with?
I mean, Austin, you've grown a lot of subscribers. I mean, I think it's like 86,000 subscribers, and you started from zero. Was that ever your vision, or it just kind of happened, or yeah? How did you grow that list, or how that happened?
Very slow at first. So I was making videos for, I want to say, about a year until I hit 100 subscribers, and I was doing like 4 videos a week, and that's when I was averaging like 10 views a video. And they're still on my page. You can find them. I've made over, I don't know, 550 videos at this point. And it was like a year and a half to 500 subscribers. And, in retrospect, a lot of that was because like, I didn't know what it was about. I wanted public speaking practice. I was, doing my best to make Bible study videos and stuff, but I had no real compelling reason why people should watch my channel instead of a bunch of other ones. And I just kind of slowly kept tinkering with it and trying. And, I don't know that I ever thought it would be my job or kind of be what it is, but there was a period where, after a year and a half to 500 subscribers, and I think it took that long to have the first video that hit 1,000 views, the time from 1,000 to 10,000 was like 6 weeks.
Whoa.
And then it kind of just really grew from there. And so there was like some moments in there where it started going like, there might be something here. But it's been a really, really fun journey. And I'm actually glad, in retrospect, that it did take so long, because I got to probably make a bunch of bad videos that no one watched. And I also got to see, like, do I actually like doing this? Long before it was ever, had any financial ties to it or anything like that. It was just, would I keep doing this if no one watched? And I got to kind of try that experiment out, which I'm grateful for.
Well, I mean, it's a great reminder, for maybe church leaders watching this, listening to this, is that you got to do you have to put in some of that work that it's not going to matter, or it's not going to feel like it matters, or no one's going to watch. But those videos you said, when there's only 10 people or less, your mom watching it, only your mom watching it, whatever, your training and your skills. And that was a great way to look at it. So, I mean, I think if you want to be a better speaker, be prepared to speak to a room of 5 people or 10 people. That will prepare you to be speak to the hundreds, or maybe even one day the thousands, or whoever. So that's a good insight into that. Can I ask you about and sorry, Melissa, if I'm
go ahead.
okay. But I liked on your website again about sharing how good the good news is. And I think kind of our approach is that. I think one of the things is people just don't know how good the good news is. And I think we have an ongoing appreciation for the good news. But how is that would you say that is your mission? And if it is, how did you come to that mission statement, or how did you come to that being an important part of what you do?
Yeah, I think, that's certainly kind of the spark that got it going, and still animates what I do, even though it's shifted like what that looks like over time. I think, for me, I went through a period where I kind of walked away from the faith, didn't want anything to do with it. And what brought me back wasn't so much arguments, even though like I was, reading plenty of stuff like that, but it was really the conviction that like I couldn't shake that I found this Jesus guy just so compelling. And it was that beauty of the good news and the goodness of it that really captured my heart and made me even care, like, to think whether or not it might be true. And so I try to have that spirit in what I'm doing. And for me, that kind of portrays itself in just the sense of curiosity, because if the good news is really good and Jesus really is, the way, the truth, and the life, then pursuing truth and looking into things should be something that's exciting and not scary, with this expectation that at the end of it is going to be something good and beautiful and true. And so I want to kind of have that spirit for people as they look into the Christian faith generally. And the way it often gets expressed on my channel now is through looking at the history of the church and trying to help people find goodness, truth, and beauty there, to see that, the good news isn't just good news to me. It wasn't just good news 2,000 years ago, but the way it's unfolded, messiness and all, of course, like it hasn't always been, a clean path, but it has been good and true and beautiful. And if people want to look into those things, they can find that there and find real sources of life for their faith. So that's kind of the way that it works out for me.
Okay, so it's more your personal walk or that drew you back, or was the goodness of the gospel that drew you back when you were wandering for a little while? Is that right?
Yeah. So, I had some real church hurt, and had some real just like mix of kind of tragedies going on in life that made me think like, what have I been sold a lie on this, and that was like kind of early high school time. And it was in looking back at Jesus and finding like, I remember for a time thinking like, I don't even know what I think of the rest of this, but I like Jesus. And slowly that's grown to kind of love the church and all its messiness because Christ loves the church. And so, yeah, that's kind of the way that's worked.
And that it was in your high school time where you doubted your faith. Is that right? Or
yeah, it was, I guess it was going into my junior year of high school. I kind of had this trifecta of some church scandal that was kind of like deeply troubling. My mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. My sister, who had chronic illness for her whole life, lost her ability to walk. And there was just some other things going on in my life. I was just like, I don't know if I want anything to do with this anymore. And so there was a bit of time between then and coming back, kind of between high school and college.
and then you kind of felt like, have I been lied to? Like everyone says, follow God and things will work out, but things aren't working out. Was that sort of part of your thinking?
Yeah. And, I don't even know that it would be so like black and white. Like, I mean, I knew that like, bad things happen to good people and there was space for that in my theology. But I think I was kind of just disillusioned, that if the people I had looked up to my whole life weren't the people I thought they were, if life was just so messy, what was this all about and where was this going? And I just wasn't sure if I wanted to have much to do with it. I don't know that I ever would have said like, I know this isn't true, but I think I just kind of stopped caring if it was, if that makes more sense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I do think that's a problem too, that what happens is, we see Christian leaders fall, and I'm not sure what story you're talking about as far as, I'm not sure you didn't use the word scandal, but, you see leaders you maybe respect and they're not as good as you thought they were. In the Catholic Church, of course, there's been lots of with priest abuse and then cover up and all that kind of things. And then people walk away from their faith. But I think one of the things you came back to is, okay, the bedrock, the core is not those people. It's the person of Jesus Christ. And that just, how did you come to that? Or did you, how did you come to that? Or how did you say, I just got to focus on Jesus first?
Yeah. I don't know what led me to have this particular realization, but I remember distinctly thinking like, okay, I recognize I'm running away from something, because faith had always been so important to me. Like growing up, I wanted to be a missionary. Faith was my whole life. And I knew, like, because I knew myself, like I was clearly running away from this. But I remember asking myself, like, what am I running toward? I know what I don't like, but like, what's the thing on the other side of this? What am I looking for besides just knowing, like, not that? And in that, in kind of a process of reflection, found like whatever it was that I didn't like, and there was plenty, it wasn't Jesus. And so that was kind of what led me to kind of go back to the Gospels. And I remember like I wouldn't read anything else in the Bible at that point. I didn't want to, but I would read the Gospels because I thought, of the church I'm mad about, various expressions of theology I'm mad about, this, that, and the other. I'm just frustrated with, or I don't want much to do with. But for whatever reason, I couldn't shake this sense that, whatever I was running away from wasn't Jesus, and I should probably give that another look.
Well, I think that might be a little bit too, and maybe that more is in the non-denominational world, that you knew to come back to Jesus because you probably had that. When I doubted my faith, which was more in college, I would say I started sophomore year through senior year in college. I kept going to church, but I didn't come back to Jesus. I don't know. I came back, and I guess some of my different things were, I wondered if it seemed like it was a big gotcha from God. Like if you don't worship me, you go to hell. I'm like, well, what kind of deal is that? Like, and then I processed that in some ways. And then in senior year, I read a lot of Nietzsche, and that kind of, am I just believing this because I'm weak and I'm like one of the weak people. And so I need Jesus or I need God. And then a little bit, I think during that year, I also read Peter Kreeft's book, Between Heaven and Hell, which just comes back to in Mere Christianity about who is the person of Jesus. And at a certain point, that's why same kind of conclusion, although a different route of, all right, at the end of the day, who is the person of Jesus Christ? If he's the Son of God who rose from the dead, then I need to follow him. If he's not, then I'll go somewhere else, And I just think, again, I think that's a great thing for maybe church leaders who are helping people through crisis of faith, that we come back to that core question, who is Jesus? Because then there is a lot of noise and a lot of things that do need to be sorted through of church leaders falling, but our faith isn't based on other people who follow Jesus. It's based on Jesus. So I think there might be some good nuggets for people who are trying to help other people through a crisis or their faith crisis, or if when we're going through it ourselves, just come back to the person of Jesus Christ, and then things begin to work out from there.
Amen.
Well, a common thread I'm hearing here through this conversation is that at some point or another, almost everyone goes through a crisis of faith. And when we look out and we see the unchurched, and we know that there are so many de-churched Catholics out there in the world who have left the faith for whatever reason, that we can help them come back. And I think, Austin, the way that you share so authentically about your crisis of faith and how, you were questioning all of this, and Tom, hearing your story too, I think we need to share more of that. I think it's so important for the de-churched out there to hear some of these stories that, hey, look, maybe we are now deeply involved in church world, but we all have had those doubts at some point or another. And I think that by authentically sharing, we can help them see, like, oh, I don't have to be perfect to be a part of this faith. In fact, nobody is perfect that's a part of this faith.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think
that's. Oh, go ahead.
Austin, go ahead if you have anything else to add. But
I was just going to say, well said. Yeah.
I think that, some of the thing, and this happens again, I think a lot of the portrayal of the saints is that people look at people who work in the church and think they've always just had that faith.
Right.
And I do have to think in some ways I have, I'm not good at making money. I'm not good. Like, there's a lot of things I'm not good at. I'm not handy. Like, there has been some ways in which I do think faith has come easier, and partly it's what I grew up with and that kind of thing. But at the same time, I think people outside think, okay, you never struggled, or you never had that, or you are perfect, and then when that person falls, that's where there's a problem. But yeah, that is where we should have to share our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses and our struggles, in the sense that, yeah, we're like you. We're and I think that's too. I think so. I get frustrated sometimes with the way saints are portrayed in the Catholic Church. Like they're polished and shiny. I'm like, no. When you dig down, they were just as flawed. Or read the scriptures. Right. We did that series many years ago called Liars, Cheaters, and Other Bible Heroes. Right. It was just meant to get rid of that veneer of these people are perfect, and that they did not come to a time where there was a time before they were following Jesus. They had to have that faith journey. And because they went on that faith journey, you can go on that faith journey too. So. Yeah,
absolutely. And Austin, as we're talking about, what are some ways that we can connect with people, especially the de-churched out there? I would love for you to share with our listeners, what advice would you give to parish leaders or a pastor who's trying to engage the de-churched through the digital world, especially reaching out to those younger audiences like your age and that next generation? How can they help them through video, social media, YouTube, those kind of platforms?
Yeah, there's a lot of different elements to it. I think one of the things I would say, and I think this is just especially true for, I was going to say young people. There's people younger than me now, which is still something I have to reckon with. But we've grown up with like everyone marketing to us, like constant marketing. And I think some parish leaders and people can assume that to reach young people, like, you've got to be as cool as possible. And like, the thing is, like, you're just not going to be that cool.
Yeah.
And I hate to break it to people, but I'm not that cool either. I just make videos about old books all day. No, but I think authenticity, like, it's such a buzzword, but it is for a reason. Like, what I would encourage, Christian leaders with is, you have something that a lot of these people don't. Like, a lot of people my age and younger are going to grow up never in church, or having de-churched and not have a good experience with it. And so I think sometimes people assume to reach, the lost or the de-church, you have to give them exactly what they could find anywhere else, which I think is the wrong way of going about that. Like, if you're, a 70-year-old priest with deep spiritual wisdom, like, you don't have to do a TikTok dance. Like, just give deep spiritual wisdom, because that's different and that's unique. Within that, though, I would say there is a good impulse and, like, wanting to be cool in that, and that is to, like, get to know your audience. And so what I would say, like, the difference is, instead of trying to be like them and do whatever they're going to think is cool, it does help. Like, if you're trying to reach people who have left the church or have never been in it, you've got to know some people like that. You've got to go out and talk to them and be able to understand what are their fears and concerns, what are their hopes and joys, and how can you speak to that in a way that makes sense. And so I guess my biggest thing would be, be authentically yourself while also understanding the world in which these people live and all of its the goods and the bads in that. Because I think when we try to reach the lost and we, you haven't gotten coffee with someone who's lost in like 7 years, it's probably going to be hard. But if you can speak, from your own experience to their experience, and you can bridge that divide in that way, I think that can be really helpful for people.
That's good stuff, Austin. I think too, like, and kind of dovetailing a little bit on what you said, we have good stuff. Like, we don't have to try, like, we need to help connect the dots for people. But going back to the whole, we have good news in every way, shape, and form. And so the word, there is the tension of, okay, if you just share the good news in a way people can't hear, then that doesn't matter. But we have really good news. Start there. I think you start with the good news, and then you figure out, okay, how do I help? Then where do I figure out where people are? Like Paul said, I'll be all things to all people so that some might be saved. I'll understand my audience. And now, out of understanding my audience, I'm going to build the runway, or I'm going to connect the dots between what I know to be good news that I've experienced. And I think there is an ongoing thing of we have to continue just to be shocked, surprised, renewed, refreshed in our spirits about how good the good news really is. Again, on so many different levels, and to keep exploring that ourselves personally, so that we have fresh stuff for others.
You are recommending spend some time with somebody who is unchurched or de-churched and get to know them. And in Rebuilt, we use Nativity's example of Timonium Tim, finding that target demographic. And when you talk about, okay, especially that person of the next generation, have coffee with them, connect with them, get to know who they are. I think there's so much value in that because, it's okay to say that, yes, we are in the marketing world a little bit, because in reality, that's what we are when we're trying to reach them. But by getting to know them, then we can understand how best to share this good news and how they'll receive it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's precisely it. And, I think it's what we'd all want, right? If we were on the other side, like, I think we can all tell when someone's trying to sell us something that it isn't a solution for any of our felt needs, right? Like, I live in a really like small townhouse with a yard that's about this big. And if someone was like trying to sell me like these giant like John Deere tractors, I'd be like, you're talking to the wrong guy. Like, you don't understand what I need. Right. And so I think in a similar way, like if you were trying to approach, a teenager and trying to help them solve whatever problem it is that they don't feel they have, that's not going to be helpful. But they do have all of these things that the gospel does speak to. I mean, the rates of anxiety and loneliness and all of these things, like these are things that the Christian tradition can speak to so well and so deeply, and especially from people who have, a little more experience. And so I think, just being sensitive to that and understanding what it is they're facing and not facing is going to be helpful.
That is something the church can offer, is some wisdom. And I want somebody who has more spiritual experience to speak into my life. And so again, depending on where you are, to not be afraid of that. That's a good thing. And I think, again, I feel like even when I was mid-20s, early 30s, having conversations with guys, and I don't know the exact address for this, so you might remember where Paul talks about, you have many you have few spiritual fathers, right? You have many models in the faith, but few. And like I was saying, we wish there was more spiritual fathers. And now I look back, I can be that kind of, but I don't know if I always step into that role, so to speak. But I do think, again, if church leaders, spiritual fathers, spiritual mothers, once you've gotten some wisdom and experience, to not be afraid to come out of it from that experience. And that's who I am. So again, just kind of affirming or agreeing with what you're saying, and then about don't be afraid of that's where you are, because I think that's where some young people are longing for and want.
Yeah, absolutely. And just real quick on the flip side of that, something I have to remind myself is like, I'm 26. Like I don't have all these answers for people. So I try to be very careful. Like if you're more in my shoes, if you've been married for 3 years, it's probably not the time to start selling a course on marriage, right? But if you want to start talking through things, like I always say, like sharing your experience trumps sharing expertise, especially when you don't have it, right? And so, for people like me, it's much more like, hey, I'm trying to figure this out too, and maybe we can figure it out together. And so I think, being sensitive to where are you in life? What do you have to offer? Be authentic to that, and don't try to, sell this great wisdom that you don't have. Or if you have this great wisdom, like why downplay that, right? Why try to take the approach of like, hey kids, I'm just like you, if you're not, like find what makes sense for you.
That's a good line. What was that line about? Experience over expertise. How did you say that?
Sharing your experience trumps sharing expertise, especially when you don't have it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I love it.
I think that's good. I love that. Well, Austin, as we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share? Maybe some surprises you've learned along the way, or something that's coming up with Gospel Simplicity that you're excited about?
Oh, so many options of places to take this question.
Or pick all of them if you want.
I think first of all, I really appreciate you guys having me on, and I want to just affirm what you guys are doing, right? That you are being curious about how to do this well. And I think it's so easy, especially today, in our worlds where we can kind of live in whatever digital echo chambers we're in, to not take that opportunity to try to step out and say like, okay, but what are people needing from the church that they're not getting, or how can we kind of be that city on a hill for people? And so I just want to say I'm encouraged by you guys doing that, by you guys willing to kind of have me on to have this discussion. And for those listening, I guess I would just encourage them to have that perspective that we've talked about today of going out and looking for those people who if you've had this beautiful experience of faith and it's life-giving and great for you, try to think of the people who haven't had that, and how can you bridge that divide for them, and maybe be that person that can help them find that beauty, truth, and goodness there too.
So good. Well, Tom, any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up?
No, yeah, awesome. It's been great having you on. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation at another point. Yeah, very thoughtful. I thought, your assessment and what you did on that episode was really good and just really thoughtful. And again, continue to hear a lot of great thoughts from you today. So, yeah, thanks for being on. And I think you got, sorry, this sounds demeaning, but I think you do have wisdom beyond your years. So I think you have a lot of wisdom to share. So I'm glad you have that forum to continue to share the wisdom that you are experiencing. And continue to want to. I'm looking forward to going back and watching some more of your videos and seeing some other thoughts you've shared. So thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's absolutely been my pleasure. Thanks to both of you.
Well, Austin, we're so grateful for you, especially for not just sharing authentically, but pouring into our listeners who are trying to make some positive changes in their local Catholic parishes as well. So thank you for taking the time to share some of your wisdom and tips and ideas with them as well.
My pleasure.
Well, to all of our listeners, please make sure to check out the show notes. We will have the link to Gospel Simplicity, especially that episode where Austin reviews Church of the Nativity. And until next time, we'll catch you on the next episode.